Right, it's 2 o'clock, isn't it? Nearly. 1400 exactly. Good afternoon, everybody. So, clearly flyable and clearly better this morning than it is now. Although you could, I don't think there is a bit of wave there, but it's not really very gappy, is it? So on the screen, can you see me from there, or do I need to stand in the way? I'm absolutely fine. Okay, good. Right, brilliant. Good afternoon. Welcome to G's course. The idea behind all the talking is that a lot of soaring courses, you go and do a soaring course and the weather's just... And today the weather's like... So if you're a professional soaring instructor, you really need to be able to talk. And I did a couple of years of working for the BGA and doing soaring course after soaring course in the UK from the beginning of the summer to the end of the summer. And of course, you know, you end up doing a lot of talking. So I realised quite early on you needed to be able to talk. Those of us that have been doing it for a long time, most of us that have been doing this for a long time, got a lot of experience, have gradually worked it out. And it's only since the geodiscus has appeared and the higher performance two-seat gliders, it's only since the last 20 or 30 years that gliding's been anything but high performance gliding. Used to be invisible. You couldn't see what people were doing. When I was learning, you couldn't see what people were doing. I remember flying with John Willie, and the only thing we had to fly was a twin Aster. Oh, dear. Horrible thing. So nowadays, you can go flying with someone in a Duo or an Arcus or an Ash or DG or all of those two-seaters, and you can see what happens. But even so, you've still got to... it's hard to get the opportunity to get the flights in. So hence, talking is useful. Out of the people in the room, how many people have got less than 100 hours? Less than 500 hours? Less than 1,000 hours? Okay. And who's got more than, say, 4,000 hours? Okay, good. So a couple of really experienced people. Some reasonably experienced people here. And quite a few beginners. So, if you want to fly cross-country, you've got to be able to climb, you've got to be able to run, you've got to be able to land out, and you've got to be able to manage your head. And out of all of those things, managing your head's the most important one. So I'll talk about that later. I'll talk about the flying stuff first, and the managing your head stuff later. If you want to fly cross-country and fly cross-country quickly, you have to be able to climb. And it's only when you can climb properly that you can do anything at all. And here's the thing. If you can't climb reliably in thermals, then you don't know whether the thermals are there or not, or whether they're any good. Think about it. If you're really bad at climbing and you continually fall out of thermals, you don't know if it's you or the thermal. So you can't make any judgments about the quality of the conditions when you're flying on your own. I mean, if you go up and you launch 3 times on aerotone, you fall down, and everybody else goes off on a 500, you can probably bet that you're not very good at flying in thermals. But if you go up this afternoon and you can't stay up, is it because the thermals are crap or because you're crap? It's really hard for a beginner to know that. And when you're a beginner, you may also not appreciate that this is a probability-driven sport. It's really hard to put exact numbers on anything or to say I was right or I was wrong. I'll go to a climb, turn, miss the core, and go on. Did I turn the wrong way? Had it just given up? Don't really know. Over the period of the day, I'll take so many thermals, there'll be a certain strength, I can work out the nature of the day. But in just one instance, turn right, turn left, you don't know whether you're going to get it right. So gliding sport, the sport of gliding, is a probability-driven sport, which is why in competitions, everybody flies together all of the time. The ones that want to win, they just fly with everybody else all the time because it's a probability-driven sport and you need to maximise your chances of climbing well, not of landing out. If you're flying on your own and you fly around a task, until you've done a lot of it, again, it's not very easy to tell if you're making good decisions or bad decisions. First of all, you've got to be able to climb reliably so you know if it's a thermal or not. And secondly, a lot of experience will tell you whether you're making good decisions or bad decisions. But when you're in the early stages, when you're a beginner, you can so often make a bad decision, a poorly thought out decision that works out well, or a really well thought out decision, doing it right, good soaring technique, that works out badly. I made a great decision 2 days ago which worked out badly. I went off track this way towards the sunshine and the new cumulus, ended up landing out. The guys slightly behind me with a slightly different sky went left, down track, downwind, off track, downwind, into the murk, caught convergence and came home. Really irritating. So it's a probability-driven sport. The best thing you can do is to learn to climb. The next best thing you can do after that is to fly with your mates. If you fly with your mates all the time, if you're constantly flying the same task as your friends, not in each other's pocket, not in the same place, not talking to each other all the time, not team flying, just flying the same task to the same places at the same sort of time of day, then you can compare your flights to your friends and you can see if you make good decisions or bad decisions. And you can perhaps learn a little bit about the conditions. I mean, you might not have spotted that you went the wrong side of the convergence, for instance. When, it was really difficult here. And somebody says, well, didn't you see the convergence? What convergence? Well, you went through it. Cloud base came down to the coast, didn't it? Yeah, well, you flew through the convergence. Duh. You've got to fly with your mates to get a big enough sample size of the day. It's a probability-driven sport. Get enough sample size on the day to be able to make judgments about whether you got it right or wrong. If you're flying on your own, it's really hard. But what you will be doing on your own to start with is flying in thermals. So I want to talk about how you climb in thermals. The very, very first thing to do is to understand how to make the glider climb in thermals. Now, the really experienced guys know this, but the really experienced guys might benefit from a little bit of revision of teaching technique. The BGA and I used to teach it, or do teach it like this. Let's see what we've got. There you go. There's a bit of a training syllabus for learning to fly in thermals, but that training syllabus hasn't ever been outlined as a syllabus. This technique, which we'll go into in a moment, is incredibly suitable for someone who's coming up to solo only just solo. When you're coming up to solo, learning to handle the airplane, only just doing your first solo soaring flights, the difficult thing to do is to learn to turn the glider accurately. It's really quite difficult. Now, it's easy enough to turn the glider enough to fly around a circuit, 90 degrees. Doesn't really matter if you're inaccurate. It's quite hard to circle continually, and it's really quite difficult to circle at the right angle of bank continually, balanced at the right speed without horsing the nose up and down. It's hard to do it. I'd say going solo is the equivalent of passing a driving test. Flying a 500 in a pure sailplane is the equivalent of driving a car around around a rally stage. You know, you've got to be able to drive it sideways, backwards, all of that slidey stuff. You've got to be able to do car control like road drivers can't do. It's like being able to drive a race car around a racetrack, you know. Braking late, drifting into the apex, four-wheel drift out, not over-controlling, getting the maximum traction, all that shit. It's like that. You need really good glider handling skills to climb in thermals. And the reason is that the best bit of the thermal is small. Even if you've got decent-sized thermals, and this is my first opportunity to make an idiot of myself, decent-sized thermals, looking from above or looking from the side. Now we all know that there's a bit in the middle that we call the core, and the rest of the outside of the thermal is a whole lot of na, where you don't really want to be. It's the core of the thermal you want to be in, and to stay in the core, you have to turn tight. This bit of the thermal, which you want to be in, is often no bigger than the circle you can fly and remain in control of the glider. In fact, almost by definition, it may be no bigger than the circle you can fly. Because if you look at the lift across this, as you pass across the middle of the thermal, if you draw a graph of the lift value across the position across the thermal, from there to there is where you want to be. Well, you may not even be able to get the glider into that small an area. Now, I do a lot of flying in Australia, I do a lot of flying in south of France, do a lot of flying in lots of good environments, and it is pretty rare that the thermal is big enough to turn in big flat circles. It's pretty rare. So let's try and put numbers on this. Those of you that have read the soaring engine books or done my briefings before will know that, as I say, I now have an opportunity to make an idiot of myself. Let's just keep up with this. So imagine you're flying along at 60 knots. That's a sort of low cruise speed for sampling across a thermal, right? You're running around at 60 knots. 60 knots is 100 feet a second. If you turn at 20 degrees of bank, that is on the order of 1,000 feet across. On the order of 1,000 feet. Might be 1,100 feet, might be 900 feet. If you're a little bit faster, a little bit slower. If you're high, it's higher. Because, of course, the air's thinner, you're going faster. It's about 1,000 feet across. 20 degree bank is about 1,000 feet across. 1,000 feet across at 60 knots is 10 seconds. And just think about what 10 seconds is in a glider. So running across, if the thermal's 10 seconds across, it's going to sound and feel like this. Let's pull up. Clearly that's a really good thermal. You do get thermals that big. I mean, under thunderstorms and out in Australia in the desert, the best part of the day under a big cloud, yeah, you get thermals that big. But generally, flying around here, actually flying around the south of England, it's not like that. Quite often you come to a thermal and it's just a few seconds across. Well, the circle you get at 30 degrees of bank is a lot smaller. It's about 600 feet across. The circle you get at 45 degrees of bank is on the order of 500 feet across. And it's really hard to turn continually at much more than 45 degrees of bank. Sorry if you got that Edge 540 that was up on the board, but not in a sailplane. You might get it down to about 450 feet across. The best I've seen on the CU, because when you do the CU analysis, you can measure, use the measuring tool to measure the width of the circle. And I don't think I've ever seen less than about 430, 440 feet, and that was in a standard label on a cold day near sea level. Really small. Usually my circles are about 200 meters, because normally I'm at altitude on a warm day, and I'm turning at about 45 degrees bank. 200 meters is about 660 feet. 45 degrees is 500 feet or so. So Reichmann, a long time ago, Helmut Reichmann, before the poor sod got killed in a mid-air collision, one of the best soaring coaches ever, he looked at the lift profile across the thermal and the rate of sink that you'd get at different angles of bank and the different turning radii at different angles of bank and the different rate of sink that you'd get. And he said, for European thermals, 40 degrees of bank is about right as a starting point. Because much more than 40 degrees of bank, it rapidly gets more difficult, and you're coming down faster and faster and faster. So there's just a pure numbers thing with sailplanes. You need to turn tight to be in a thermal, at least 40 degrees of bank. And I'd put it to you, since gliders have got faster and heavier since Helmut Reichmann was flying sailplanes, you probably want to be working it a little bit harder. So I normally say to people, turn at 45 degrees of bank. So here's rule number one. Geez, rule number one. TLF, usually 45 degrees of bank. You can work out yourself what TLF stands for. Right. That's the first thing. So when you're in lift, you turn. Now, the point of teaching it like this, right at the beginning, is to teach the beginner, and if you're a beginner, you need to practice this. When the Vario winds up, when you're in lift, you turn. You don't go, ooh, that's really nice. Maybe the experience of soaring in a glider is not sort of, ooh, yeah. It's boom, yeah, run like that. Because what you're trying to do is to stay within the confines of the thermal. You turn tight, not because it increases the rate of climb. It doesn't, it wrecks the rate of climb. If you turn the glider really hard, it wrecks the performance, but you turn really hard to stay within the thermal. You're not thinking of going up. You're not thinking of going up, going up, going up, going up. You're thinking of staying here, staying here, staying here. Keep it tight. So, first thing you do is turn. And for a beginner, this way of teaching it will give you something like this. It'll keep you near the thermal. Every time you come out of the thermal, you wind off the bank and relax a bit. When you get into the thermal, you turn tighter. Let's just... come on, baby. Should just scroll, thank you. You're quite likely to end up doing something like that. That's the BGA's default centering technique. It's really not very effective, but it does keep you in the air. And as you know, you want to be at the right sort of speed. If you're flying say you're flying something like an LS4, an ASW19 or a Labelle, and you're going to turn at 40, 45 degrees of bank, what sort of speeds are you going to think about using? What are the numbers? Any advance on that?
I'm sorry, which glider are you talking about?
Yeah, well, here you go. Let's say you're flying an ASW19 or an LS4. What sort of numbers for a 45-degree bank turn?
55. 45. 55, 60. 50, 55.
Because it's quite a big range. I just wanted to know. It's quite a big range. It does depend on the sailplane, but I normally work on somewhere between 50 and 55 knots for a 45-degree bank turn. If you're flying a glass sailplane and you can turn 45 degrees at less than about 50 knots, you're flying an exceptionally good one. An LS6 with no water in it, yeah, you can turn really tight, especially in the 18 meter version. You can turn 45 degrees at 45 degrees at 45 knots. Go up like that. That tub out there, the 25, I need well over 55 knots to turn. I need to turn at 55 knots. Modern gliders, usually you're going to be doing 55 knots. So if you can go slower, yeah. But all these numbers are worked out really on turning at about 55, 50 to 55.
What about starting relatively fast and slowing down?
Yeah, as you get more stabilised in the thermal, you just get it all sort of wound in, especially if the thermal gets a bit bigger as it goes up. You can wind out and slow down a bit if you're really sorted and centred. There's a bit more of an advanced technique. Now, instructors talk about the speed to fly the glider, and I remember reading in the instructor manual, if the student's going up and down by more than 4 knots or so in each direction, they can't fly. Well, actually, that's not true. That's just not true. There are reasons that the speed goes up and down in the thermal. We'll come to those a bit later. What you want to do is to keep the nose in the same place. That's really important. So as you go like that, the nose stays in the same place. It doesn't go sideways and it doesn't go up and down. And if you're a bit fast, you just raise the nose ever so slightly and wait. By far the dominant controller of speed when you're circling is the movement of the air, not the attitude of the glider. In a modern glider, if you raise the nose, especially if you raise the nose in the turn, it takes a long time for the speed to reduce. If you lower the nose in the turn, it takes a long time for the speed to stabilise at a higher speed. But if you fly through lift and sink and turbulence, then the speed will jump and hold, jump and hold, jump and hold, jump and hold. We'll come back to that. So you want constant attitude, not constant speed. You can't fly at a constant speed in a proper thermal. It's not worth trying to do it because you're always going to be behind the game. You can fly at a constant attitude, which is the attitude for roughly like the right speed, and you let the speed go up and down because it will. It's just going to. Right, okay, so stage 1, you're thermaling like this. This is pretty much no good for going cross country. It's good for keeping you in the air whilst you're learning to soar. Stage 2 is to recognise when you're outside the thermal. So let's say you're flying something like that, and you want to be in better lift. This is where it gets difficult, except it isn't actually difficult if you've got round thermal. It's very easy, but most people there's a natural tendency when you're floating around in and out of the thermal to want to be in the core of the thermal. That's the problem that you set yourself. Where is the core? I want to find the core. I want to find the middle. Well, if you want to find the middle, this is what people do. One of the things they do is they watch the Vario come up. And when the Vario starts to come up, they say, oh, I'm going towards the middle of the thermal. So if I'm going towards the middle of the thermal, I need to go this way. and then I need to turn again. And that all sounds great, doesn't it? And that all looks terrific. The problem is, the Vario is late. If you're turning at, if you're turning at 45 degrees of bank, it's something like 18 seconds around the turn, something like that. So it's a little bit less than 5 seconds a quarter. The Vario lags. The Vario lags a lot. Let's talk about Vario lag. So there's two parts to the variometer. Total energy variometer sees the height of the glider change, and it sees the speed of the glider change. Because obviously when you dive for speed or when you slow up, if it can't register the speed as well as the height change, a vertical speed indicator would just go 10 knots up, 10 knots up, 10 knots up, boom, and 10 knots down, 10 knots down, 10 knots down. So,
Self-cleans. Finish in a minute.
nice. So if the Vario can't sense the speed as well, then when you do leave the thermal, whoosh, 100 knots, whoosh, 60 knots, then it would go minus 10, minus 10, minus 10, minus 10, minus 5, minus 5, minus 10, plus 10, plus 10, plus 10, plus 10, minus 2, which is no bloody use if you're trying to soar. So the Vario can see the speed. So when you pitch over to accelerate, part of the Vario goes, hey, we're going down, we're going to thicker air. I'm going to go down. And the other part of the Vario goes, hang on, not so fast. We're going faster and faster and faster. You must be diving. Let's bring the needle up a bit. Increased airspeed gives you a lift of the needle. Increased height gives you a lift of the needle. Decreased height, the needle goes down. Decreased airspeed, the needle goes down. So, decreased height, needle goes down. Increased speed, needle comes up. So what you actually get is minus 2, minus 3, minus 4, minus 5, minus 5, minus 6, minus 6, minus 6, minus 6, minus 6, minus 6. Minus 5, minus 4, minus 3, minus 2, minus 2, minus 2, minus 2. That's how your total energy works. It sees the speed and the height at the same time. Well, so when you fly in and out of gusts in the thermal and the speed jumps, the Vario jumps because it sees the speed at the same time. When you fly in the lift doesn't register quickly because the glider has to change its altitude to generate the pressure difference that the Vario sees as a height change. So the glider's got to go from here and start moving upwards to generate some height so the Vario can read a rate of change. It's a little bit like you get in a fast car and you floor it. Getting a Tesla Model S. Fire it up, switch the control to ludicrous. It's really good in ludicrous. Put your foot down. Instantly, it's so you can feel the acceleration. But if you watch the speed's just doing this. It takes some time to get to 60. If you fly into a strong thermal, boom! But the glider flies a curve. It takes some time to get a rate of change, which registers on the Vario. So the reality is, as you fly in and out of the horizontal gusts, the Vario goes, and when you fly in the lift, the glider goes, it's a little bit late. Here's the lift. So the Vario is late. We'll talk about gusts, speed changes again in a little bit. But if this is 2, 4, 6, the Vario is going to give you something like 2, 4, 6. It's something like 30 degrees of the turn late. Those of you that are learning and you fly with experienced instructors, you've probably had that experience where the instructor in the back says, turn now, and you turn and the Vario comes up because you felt instructor felt the glider do this, you just feel it going up. So that's the other thing. You could not use the Vario. The Vario is late and confusing because of the gusts on the side. So you could not use the Vario. You could use your arse, seat of the pants. Actually, the otoliths, but it sounds better to say you use the seat of your pants. You feel the glider go up. When are you going to feel the most acceleration? I'll tell you, when you're pointing pretty much straight at the core of the thermal, because when you're pointing at the core, you're crossing the contour lines the fastest. So, the Vario is late. What about the acceleration? The best signal from the seat of the pants is going to come here and here as you cross the contour lines as a steep angle. So if you straighten up on the Vario, you'll be late. If you straighten up on the Vario, you're going to be late in moving. Let's do it. Let's straighten up on the Vario and see where we get. Here's the thermal again. Glider coming through here. This is the flight path we did have. The Vario is telling you to straighten up and move towards the core. You straighten up and move towards the core. You've moved your circle that way. It's not terribly effective. It's late. If you use the acceleration, the sense of acceleration, assuming a half in and half out of the thermal, so your thermal circle is a little offset. Use the sense of acceleration. You might feel acceleration here. You're more likely to feel a bit more acceleration as you cross the contour lines at a steeper angle. If you're even more offset, you'll feel more acceleration. How much acceleration you feel depends on which direction you're crossing the contour lines. That's the ideal example, really. A little bit more. If you straighten up when you feel the acceleration, you're likely to do that. You're likely to be late. Straighten up on the acceleration, you tend to be late. Straightening up on the thermal, you tend to be, on the Vario, you tend to be even bloody later. It just is not terribly effective. And the feel of that, the sound of that is like this. You might recognize this. Going up. So you move. I've just flown across the core and out the other side. That must be familiar to many of you. Straight, wings level across the core, straight out the other side. So I'm giving this briefing, my life of a soaring coach. I got this really good gig in South Africa. I went to the Swalu Lodge, which belongs to the Oppenheimers. It's on the edge of the Kalahari Desert. And I was coaching at a meeting called the Swalu Challenge. And they have 4 world champions, 4 current world champions, and 5 or 6 South African team people or South African squad people. The squad, like the wannabes for the team. So the team people are really good. The world champions are obviously way better than me. And the squad are all sorts of levels trying to come up. And so my brief for the coaching is you need to run briefing sessions. So I'm running a how to thermal session for Sebastian Kawa, Michael Summer, I mean, for God's sake. And the hooligans, and they're really good people in the squad. And so I do this, and I say, let's get to the end and say, right, obviously that's just me, that's what I'm teaching. Guys, you're all better than me at thermal soaring. What am I doing wrong? How can I improve it? How can I improve the teaching? And Sebastian Carver said, you have to talk about flying away from sink. So I talked to him at some length about this. And then I went off and worked with the Australian coaches, and we talked at some length about this. And I think actually the best way to climb is to fly away from the sink. I'll explain why in a minute. In terms of sports psychology, it's a classic reframing of the problem. You're thinking, I want to fly towards the core of the thermal. Actually, that's not really what you want to do. We talked about the thermals being small. If you put the glider right in the core of the thermal, you're going to come out the other side of the thermal. Because the thermals are small. You can't be in the core of the thermal. You can be in the whole core of the thermal if you're flying a paraglider. You know, the parachute stays there and the pilot goes around the outside. I mean, the parachute stands still. You can fly in a thermal that's the size of this room with a paraglider. Well, you get the wings in. But you can't in a glider. It goes straight across the core and out the other side. That's the problem. If you think I want to put the glider in the core of the thermal, then as you point at the core, all these signs, either the Vario coming up, which is about late, or the acceleration, is a sign that you're moving towards the core of the thermal. So you go this way, I want to be at the core, and then you turn, and you're very likely to be half in and half out of the thermal again. It's not the way to do it. The way to do it is to move the circle that way, so the glider's in the core of the thermal. So look. The props. Here's the thermal. So the thermal is a bit shitty on the edges, stronger in the middle. And here's the circle you're flying. So here you are, in and out. Now, if I straighten up and move the glider as I come towards the core, then I move the circle in this direction. Yeah? Flying across the core of the thermal, I move the circle in this direction. The time to move the circle is when you're coming out of the sink. Here. Because if I straighten up here, I'll move the circle in that direction. In other words, you need to move it earlier than you think you need to move the circle. So it's worth thinking about it this way. It has legs. And we tried teaching it this way in Australia, and it worked really, really well. So let's draw the thermal again. There's a thermal. Here's your circle. You don't have to be very far off the circle, off the thermal, to spend a lot of time in bad air. And the best climb rate you can get is to be here. Yeah? And turning as tight as you can. You would be amazed how many times I turn like this, and then I go, let's just try a little bit slacker. And I turn here, and I'm out of the thermal. It doesn't take much to be out. But quite often the thermal's only a little bit smaller than the circle you can fly. So in order to move from here to here, you come out of the thermal, you come out of the thermal. I'm not in good air, I'm rubbish air, rubbish air, rubbish air. It just starts to get better, and before it gets good, I'm moving and then turning again. So just as you leave the bad side of the thermal. So it looks and sounds more like this. This is how chasing the core looks and sounds. So as you roll out, the Vario's peaking and you catch it. Roll up, roll out, push uphill. When you get to what you think is the best bit, you turn and you fall out the side of the thermal. What I'm suggesting you do here. And the core's here. I've gone around the back of the core, but I'm still in the thermal. I haven't gone across the core, here and out the side. I've rolled out early and I've gone around the back of the core, and as I turn, I'm coming round the core. So I suggest that you might try and think of your thermal soaring in that way. Two, fly away from the sink. So wait until you're just coming back into the thermal and then move. If you're spending a lot of time outside the thermal, move. If you're just in and out, then, and quite often I'll just do this. You'd be surprised just how often you're in a situation where the size of your circle is pretty much the same size as the bit of the thermal you want to be in. You don't have to be very far away to be out of the bit of the thermal you want to be in. It's often very, very close to the size of the circle. So that's part number one. Are we happy so far? I hope that makes sense. I don't know if that has some resonance. You probably need to go away and think about it.
How long would you say you need to level the wings for?
If you're mostly in the thermal, then it's just literally, and it wouldn't even be leveling the wings. I'd go from 45 to maybe 25, back to 45. Just like with this glider, it's flat and back in. If I'm mostly in the climb, then I won't move very far. If I'm mostly out of the climb, then I move a long way. For instance, if I pull up in the thermal and I turn right and immediately fall out, it's obviously over there, then as soon as I'm anywhere near coming out of the worst part of the sink, I'll turn and I'll go straight for 2 or 3 seconds and start again. Or 3 or 4 seconds. But generally it's more slacken and in. And you're not tending to slacken and go up the hill. If you feel that, you've left it a bit late and you're going towards the core. And you need to go kind of slacken and go round the back of the core, and then you need winding it into the core as you turn. It's a different feeling. So not that long.
What if you're doing it on vertical acceleration?
You'll tend to be late because you get the best vertical acceleration when you're running straight towards the core. And if you're running straight towards the core, it's too late to move, because if you take the bank off, you're just going to shift your circle across the core and out the other side. It would work, that would work in a circumstance that if that's the shape of the thermal and this is your turn, and you feel good acceleration here, then yes. Then yes, you move on the acceleration.
Well, I was reading an article, listening to an article by Mike Fox, and it's a technique that he suggested, because I think that's great, because we were purely using a variometer, where we're using an instrument to give us our cues, but we've got our sensory cues as well. And the technique that Mike Fox offered was that you turn on when the vertical acceleration stops.
Yes, and that's good in this circumstance. You open out the turn, and when the vertical acceleration stops, you turn in again. The problem is, so many times, the thermal's actually small in relation to the circle you're flying. And you can't run up the hill until the vertical acceleration stops and then turn, because you're off the thermal. You're off the thermal. The thermal's too small to do that with. So this is the worst part of the thermal. Opening out as you come back into the thermal is still going to work. Generally, when it's difficult because you can't turn tight reliably, so you don't really turn very tight, and the thermals are small. So generally when it's difficult, you're not in this situation where you can feel the acceleration and run up the hill, run up the hill, and run up the hill and turn. You're more likely to be in this situation where the thermal's really small and you're spending most of your time outside the thermal. And you can't just run up the acceleration and turn because you're, again, half outside the thermal. So that's the dynamics of it. Yeah, go on. There was another question. Yeah. Yes.
And when it's pointing, when the nose is pointing to the thing that's on the wingtip,
yeah, that's pretty much the same. That's pretty much the same thing. That's called the worst heading method. So the idea is that when you're here, you look that way, and you pick a reference point. When you're here, you look for that reference point, and you go that way. And you move the whole circle that way. Yes, the only thing is, if you're a little bit late because of the variometry being late, then you'll move your circle that way.
kind of what I've been trying to say. It's like, hang on, my vario's lagging, so actually is it telling me,
Yeah.
do I go 90 degrees or do I go 45 degrees?
It's probably on average, when you're in the worst part of the thermal with the Vario, you probably want to go another 60 degrees. So rather than going there towards the red coat, I'd go there towards the camera.
So to summarise then, I mean, because the technique that you've described originally seems to me to be the most accurate one. Can we just summarise that again so it's clear in my
What you do is, as soon as you're coming out of the sink, you say to yourself, I don't want to be in the sink. I'm just going to move away from the sink. So as soon as you're coming into a bit of the thermal that you can live with, not a good bit, but not in the bad bit, you open up and you fly 2 or 3 seconds wide and then you turn again. Every time you come out of this bad bit, then you move a little bit. Yeah, when it starts to squeak. When it starts to squeak at you and say, there's an inside and outside the thermal. There's an inside and outside the core, and there's an inside and outside the thermal. When you leave the outside and you get inside the thermal, then you move. The moment that happens. It's one way of teaching it. It's very effective. Now, I want to talk about why it's difficult to climb. We talked about thermals are too small. Gliders are too fast, thermals are too small. It's really hard to turn the glider really tight. It's hard to do it. Somebody with less than 500 hours is going to find it hard to scrape around here at 45, 50 degrees of bank, and at the same time keep track of all the other stuff that's going on. It's hard to do. The Vario is just a liar. The Vario is just a liar. It's a total energy Vario. It doesn't tell you whether the glider is going up and down. That's not what it's for. And you know, you get in the glider for the first few flights and the instructor says, that's the altimeter, it tells you how high you are. Well, no, it doesn't. This is the ASI, it tells you how fast you're going. Not really. This is the compass, it tells you which way you're pointing. Oh, really? I'd like a compass that would do that. And this is the Vario, it tells you whether you're going up or down. Actually, no, it doesn't. It doesn't do that. It tells you whether you're gaining or losing energy, which is not the same thing. When you dive for speed out of the thermal in still air, yes, the Vario tells you that you're going down at an increased speed. But actually, you're not going down at that speed. You dive for speed. You're going down at 1,000 feet a minute in this part. And when you pull up to slow down and stop, if you do that in still air, the needle is still down and just coming back up slowly whilst you're going up. The Vario doesn't tell you that you're going up and down, and you don't want it to tell you that you're going up and down, because the glider does so much of this when you're flying. Pull up into a thermal, you're going up at 1,000 feet a minute. How are you going to sense that there's a couple of knots of lift here? You need an instrument that doesn't tell you you're going up and down. So the variometer sees the speed, sees the height, registers the one against the other, and displays the rate of change of energy on the needle. So you're on aerotow, you hook the nose on, you hook the cable on the nose, you take up slack, all out. Before you come off the ground, needle's up here, right? Vario's up there. You're not off the ground. You're not climbing, but you're getting more energy. You're getting more speed without diving, so it's showing more energy. Or you wrap it up to cloud base. You're in a strong climb, you wrap it up to cloud, there's a lot of cloud ahead of you. Wrap it up to cloud, get to cloud base, accelerate, and the Vario's going, so accelerate, accelerate, and I've heard people say, I went faster and faster and faster, and I was still going up. Well, if you were still going up, you'd be in the cloud now. You weren't going up. You're getting more energy, and you were turning that energy into speed, not height. You weren't going up, otherwise you'd have been 200 feet into cloud by now. So the total energy Vario tells you about the energy state of the airplane, the changing energy state. It doesn't tell you about your height. The trouble is when you're trying to climb, you tend to think that when the Vario goes, you're going up. And it's just not the case. I should really put this video on the computer and play it to you, but I haven't got it on the computer. Now is the right moment to do this. So if you could just bear with me, I have a nice little video. I've got 6% left, so I might just get away with this. Nice little video from autumn 22. Bear with me. Autumn 22. Amarama, Lasham, Amarama. 21 October 22. This is now, I don't know how many people can see the needle here, but if you can't see the needle on the ASI, you need to come round a little bit. If you watch the needle on the ASI and listening to the Vario, there's quite a couple between increasing the speed. Not every time. Not every time, but a lot of the times the speed comes on. Come on. Oh, it's gone silent now. So, when the speed increases, if you increase the speed, stop it. If you increase the speed without diving, if the speed increases without diving, the Vario goes up. That's what we call a gust. This is why it happens. As the thermal rises up, it tends to do this at the top and that at the bottom. We get dusters, willy-willies, which is conservation of the angular momentum of the inflow. That's the boundary of the thermal. Outside the thermal, the air has to move out of its way. The air has to move out of the way of the thermal, like out of the way of a boat. The average British thermal, which is both small and weak, consists of 80,000 tonnes of air moving. 80,000 tonnes of air is what you get if you measure a cylinder a quarter of a mile across and half a mile high. That's 80,000 tonnes of air at 1 kilo a cubic metre. There's a lot of cubic metres there. And okay, the best part of the thermal that you want to be in is probably that bit, which isn't 80,000 tonnes of air, but there's your 80,000 tonnes of air going up. So it just shoves the air mass aside, it shoves its way through the air mass. And you see this happen because you see pileus clouds on the top as it pushes the air up. You see dusters underneath as it leaves a gap underneath and the air's got to swirl in and fill it. You feel the thermal go across as the thermal goes across you and the inflow reduces the speed of the wind. Then the inflow increases the speed of the wind. So look, windsock. So if the wind's coming from there and it's drifting that way, that's sucking, so the wind's falling to nothing. That's sucking, so the wind's increasing. So if you fly across this thermal, in a glider, here, nothing. Here, you get increased airspeed. Here, you get lift. Here, you get lift, but you get reduced airspeed. The airspeed will change as you fly across the top. More, less. We just saw that speed going up and the outside going, it moves like a Vario because there's a couple between the speed and the Vario indication. Here, you fly through here, reduced airspeed as you fly into the inflow. And that's that sensation where you're flying along, and the glider drops its nose and accelerates forwards in the inflow. Here, you might get a nice clean sensation of lift and sink as you go across the thermal. Lift as the glider starts doing this. Sensation of sink as the rate of climb reduces as you come out the other side. It's not going down, just going up less quickly, but that's your humpback bridge sensation. That feels like that when you go up and then the rate of climb reduces. So lots of speed changes as you go across the thermal. Even worse when you're circling in a state of shear. Wind shear happens because when there's no thermals, the air's not mixing vertically. If the air's not mixing vertically, you can easily end up with a situation where here the wind's doing this and here the wind's doing that. Happens a hell of a lot of time in Australia. Overnight you get really big wind shears develop. Happens a fair bit here. Overnight you get a wind shear. Thermal punches up through the flow in the morning. A red pen. Thermal punches up through the flow. So here's the bubble coming up through the flow. And it's coming off the ground, and the wind's quite gentle on the ground. It comes up here, and the wind starts to increase. So when it gets to here, you've got a situation where the thermal itself is probably moving downwind at that speed and moving up at that speed. Here, the thermal's moving up at this speed and downwind at this speed, but the wind around it is blowing over the top, around the sides, underneath, cutting it off. So if you sample across here in a condition of shear, now you've got a situation which is, here's your thermal looking from above, and around the thermal, the wind is blowing. So the thermal's obstructing the general flow of the wind. It's accelerating the wind here around the edges of the thermal. It's squeezing around the thermal. So now, imagine flying this circle. It's all right if you stay in the thermal. What if you come out of the thermal here? What's going to happen to the airspeed indicator? It's going to jump. What's going to happen to the sound of the Vario? We just saw that. Needle jumps. So the Vario will jump here. The Vario's not lying to you. You have extra energy. But it's speed, not height. Now you could pull the glider up, but you don't really need to because it will go up. Turn here. Now, what happens when you run into the thermal coming in the other direction? What does the needle do there on the air side? No? No? Think about it. Tailwind, less tailwind. The thermal's not moving as fast as the wind. So you're running into a thermal which is holding its position in the flow. So the speed jumps again. Plus here, this is dynamic soaring. If you turn on the other side of the thermal, you run into a tailwind, you're punching into a headwind, and you run into less headwind as you hit the thermal. So this is minus, minus. This is plus, plus. Now, generally, on a sheary day, when you see a cloud like that, you know that the wind is going like that. Generally, if you go to this cloud, I put it to you, you would turn that way. Generally, not that way. You'd turn into the up shear side, wouldn't you? Always turn up shear, because it's what you do, isn't it? The reason that works more often than not is because if you come out the front, it's plus, plus. If you come out the back of this, you get absolutely drubbed. There are other reasons for concentrating your circle towards this end of the cloud, not towards this end of the cloud, but we tend to turn up shear for very good reasons. I'll talk about the albatross. Mr. Albatross is a fascinating bird. Dynamic soaring is real. You see the results of dynamic soaring on your Vario, but you don't necessarily know that that's what you're doing. It just confuses you. But the dynamic soaring is real. The albatross does this. Here's a cliff. And here's the wind blowing up it. And the seagulls do this. In the ridge lift. And the albatross does this. So if you imagine the flow over the ridge, lots of wind here, not much wind here. You're in the wind shadow here. Those of you that have flown model gliders, you'll know you can launch off the top and then walk back a few yards and you're not in much wind. You're not on the crest, you're out of the wind. So the albatross does this. Here's the hill. Here's the flow. The albatross does this, just like the guys with the dynamic soaring slope soarers. That's what he does. And he'll do that over the water too, in the wind shear over the water, where it's level, well, little waves, but you get wind shear over the water. And the albatross goes all the way from New Zealand to South America, sleeping on the wing, and dynamic soaring all the way. It doesn't go there in thermals. Frigate birds go around in thermals, but the albatross goes there purely dynamic soaring. it works. It's such a good way of extracting energy from the atmosphere that the whole species of seabirds has learned to make their living out of dynamic soaring. So what does that mean for you? What it means is that when you're flying in a thermal, if you fly through a speed change, energy, time, the speed change changes the energy of the glider like that. You fly into plus or minus, and it changes the energy of the glider like that. And the Vario does that. And that is not very long. So you go boom, height change, Vario, that is several seconds in terms of the response delay. So your variometer responds to speed changes, responds to gusts, and it does it really, really quickly. So you tie in the look and the feel of the gust with the look and the sound of the Vario moving, and you think, oh, I've got a really fast Vario. No, you haven't. It's just really quick responding to the gusts. It's not quick responding to the change of height. So you'll fool yourself about how good you think the Vario is. Now, those of us who've done thousands of hours of gliding have gradually worked this out. But in the first 500 hours, I continually centered myself out of thermals. When I hit the gust, I'd go, and I'd fly right out of the thermal by flying out the side or the front of the thermal in the gust. Right out. Just continually doing that all the time. So you have to learn to tell the difference between the lift and the speed changes. Again, because of the geometry of how the speed changes affect the glider in various circumstances, and because of the timing, you're not really vulnerable to making those mistakes if you open up as you come out of the worst part of the thermal. Again, you fly through the sink, you keep it tight in the sink, tight in the sink, tight in the sink, open out as you come out of the sink. So my turning algorithm and the way I teach it is, I'm in lift, so turn, out of the lift, turn. Sometimes you have to give it away a little bit to keep the glider flying, but turn. Here's the worst bit, turn. Coming out of the sink, turn, in the sink, turn. Coming out the sink, turn. So I just do when I come out of the bad part of the thermal. Now, quite often I'll go around the bad part and I'll say to whoever I'm flying with, this is the bad bit, this is the bad bit, this is the bad bit, leaving the bad bit. It's very effective. Okay, let's take a comfort break and then we'll do the next bit.